I'm Chris Stevenson, and this is our fifth and final video in this series on mechanics and character creation in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. In the first 4 videos in this series, I covered general topics, attributes, skills, and disciplines. This video is all about advantages and disadvantages. Note that while I did cover all of the skills and attributes and disciplines in the 2nd through 4th videos in the series, I am not going to go over every single possible advantage and disadvantage. There's an awful lot of them. If that's something that folks are interested, let me know in the comments and I can revisit the rest. But I'm going to try to cover the ones that are most likely to come up or to have something distinctive to say beyond, wow, it can really be crippling if you take that disadvantage. During character creation, you're required to take both advantages and disadvantages, although only a small number of each. Personally, I would recommend that storytellers grant extra advantage dots and allow players to take more disadvantages to gain even more advantage dots. While I will note some particular instances below, in general, the rules as written are quite stingy on these during character creation. So what of these advantages and disadvantages might be noteworthy? Well, let's start with looks, right? It's noteworthy enough that it used to be an attribute, appearance. How often looks come up will vary based on the storyteller, and that's probably one of the reasons why it got downgraded from an attribute to an advantage or disadvantage. It's not going to matter that much when interacting with other vampires, who you have probably interacted with before, but it can matter a great deal in one-off interactions with mortals. There can be a real social cost to not meeting conventional beauty standards. And some stories may let you get away with being repulsive without it ever really mattering. But don't be the player who's always trying to insist that their stunning looks apply to every single social situation, and don't be the player who complains when being repulsive turns out to matter. Note that one significant aspect of the looks advantage is that it will almost always apply to siren hunting roles. Combined with presence and a decent charisma, and you can have an attractively large dice pool for that hunting role. Resources. Probably the single most powerful advantage. As the lady said, money changes everything. Indeed, too much resources can be a quick way to a boring unlife. When you can get anything money can buy, and money can buy pretty much anything, where's the drama? Contacts, allies, fame, enough money can replace all of them if the storyteller isn't careful. And solving problems with your checkbook usually isn't that interesting. So resources are the sort of thing I would strongly encourage players to take dots in because it will have a really big impact if you don't have any resources. But it's also something I tend to discourage players from taking too many dots in because it can just circumvent too much. Haven. The biggest thing about Haven, for me, is that you don't have to take it. No points in Haven does not mean you don't have a Haven. It just means you don't have something fancy. Now, if you want to take the no Haven flaw and basically define your character by being hosed in that way, you can, but just not having the Haven advantage does not deny you a Haven. What a Haven rating does affect is the defensibility of your Haven. And keep in mind that Haven and resources are mechanically distinct. Having lots of resources does not buy you the mechanical benefits of a Haven. Within the context of the Haven background, you might want to look at taking the compromised flaw, because there can be interesting play to have a vampire who has a Haven, but it's not 100% safe. Vampire is a game where being invincible is not always the most interesting thing to do. Compromise can help further story. Vulnerabilities can be interesting, and that one isn't overwhelming. But many of the Haven upgrades are so narrow that it is hard to see many storytellers actually requiring them. You have to buy a merit to have a library, or have somewhere to lock up a prisoner, or to have a gun around. It depends on how strict your storyteller's being, but I think a lot of the time your storyteller is not going to follow those. So, Herd. Earlier in this video series, I talked about how you aren't locked into one kind of feeding based on predator style. Well, you will be if you take the obvious predator flaw under the herd category, and it will mess up an awful lot of mortal social interactions as well. Overall, herd is of questionable value. If you're willing to sink tons of points into herd, you will probably only have to feed once a week to maintain yourself, if you aren't using any disciplines or increasing attributes or any of that. But from a mechanical perspective, with that many points, you could just have a domain and chess rating that reduces your hunting roll's difficulty to 2, which can generate far more blood in the long run. And I'll come back around to the domain advantages later on. Status. In some settings, like any Camarilla city, for example, a lack of status can be crippling. Make sure that you take a dot in status if you want your character to be taken in any way seriously by the city's power structure. But a new vampire generally should not have more than 1 of that. Now, I mentioned earlier that the background points are fairly stingy in V5. And one of the reasons is that not only do you not get that many points, but for some of the advantages, low point versions don't do a lot. And allies is the poster child for advantage overcosting. Allies are way too expensive in a way that makes it just a mechanically terrible background. Contacts in V5 are more expensive than they were in prior editions of Vampire, but even a 1-dot contact will help out once per story. 1-dot allies don't exist. A 2-dot ally, 1 in effectiveness and 1 in reliability, is incompetent and only helps half the time for 2 points. A reasonably competent ally who will show up but take a while to do it is 4 dots. That's more than half of the advantage dots you get at character creation. Hard pass. Allies should be a great way to develop your character's connections to humanity, but the cost in the rules as written makes it incredibly difficult to justify. On the other hand, you could take a gifted or deadly enemy with this as a disadvantage. 1 or 2 point flaw. Enemies can make games interesting, so hey, why not grab some extra credit for them? The weakness of the allies background is further emphasized by the third of our human resources backgrounds, which is retainer. Retainer, in a mechanical sense, is probably the most useful of these. As we've discussed, allies are just really expensive because you have to pay twice for a given ally. Contacts are better, but are still fairly expensive, right? You may be paying multiple dots for one source of information, and often they express the value of the information you'd get from this source of information in terms of resources, right? I mean, it's literally just you're better off buying another dot of resources than buying a 1-dot contact who can get you cheap, trivial sorts of things. Retainers do a little bit better because you don't have to double pay for them like allies. And they can actually do things unlike contacts, right? Contacts are generally going to be information sources. Retainers will actually do things for you. And indeed, they may be more useful than allies in that a level 3 retainer is probably a gifted mortal, plus they're also a ghoul, plus you don't have to pay to get them to show up. Now, you have to do something to maintain their loyalty, right? This is someone you're hiring. It's someone that you're blood bonding. They can be subverted away from that level of control. But you know what? So can your contacts and your allies. And if your contacts and your allies are being interesting, then your storyteller's probably going to put them at jeopardy and use them to get at you. Right? That's what they should be doing, right? Again, this is a game of vampire. Nothing is safe. Nothing is sacrosanct. So out of those three, retainer mechanically is probably the most interesting. But again, I just come back to with allies more than anything, but even with contacts to a lesser extent, that the game, by focusing on humanity, by using a mechanic like touchstones, tries to emphasize characters' connections to the mortal world, and then it uses these backgrounds that represent those connections, especially contacts and allies, right? Like a retainer, maybe you've got them ghouled, and so there's already that supernatural element to it, but contacts and allies are usually just pure humans. But then it prices them so badly that it's very hard to ever take them, which is just a real shame, I think. Anyhow, moving on. Fame. Fame has its ups and downs, but there's a lot of interesting role-playing potential, in addition to the practical usefulness of people going out of their way to help you, and some shielding against overt physical assault because your enemies have to worry about a masquerade issue if you disappear. The mask advantage is either useless or priceless, depending on the sort of story that you're playing. Most player characters in the history of Vampire never really developed a formal persona distinct from their own. And if your storyteller is focusing on the Second Inquisition, it's not like a few advantage dots is going to make you immune to them. In theory, in the long term, every vampire will need a mask. But the utility of mask as an advantage will be very storyteller dependent. Influence. Influence is quite handy for getting things done without bogging the game down in role-playing out your character's efforts to subvert the county clerk or local zoning official. That's valuable. The despised flaw is another one of those that can be an easy 2 points if you aren't planning on being a mortal political player. And hey, even if the storyteller actually gets your haters involved in the story, that's okay, because again, enemies make games interesting. Under the mythic category, there are a lot of flaws, but there's a couple I specifically would suggest avoiding. Please do not take stake bait. If you take stake bait, you are being a jerk to your storyteller. The stake bait flaw either never matters or it kills your character. That's tough on your storyteller because they probably don't want to just kill your character off, and they probably don't want to just let you have 2 free points. Don't put your storyteller in that position. I also would be hesitant about taking stigmata, but for different reasons. It may not seem like much, but vampires are already getting pretty touchy at Hunger 4, and bleeding all over the place can really get in the way of rectifying that hunger problem. Linguistics. Not a bad pickup to speak a second language, but in another one of those points are stingy here, it's prohibitively expensive to be fluent in multiple languages or to play a concept like a scholar of dead languages. Another much narrower but notable one is substance use, because there's a lot of swinginess there. The disadvantages are debilitating. Like I said, I'm not going to go through every single disadvantage that's debilitating, but the disadvantaged versions of substance use are definitely in that category. But the flip side of it, the high-functioning addict, when set up properly, can be extremely helpful. If you, as the player, are interested in playing out a character who establishes a ready supply of persons using your drug of choice, possibly because you're selling it to them, thus getting you money too, you can get a perpetual 1-die bump to all of your take your pick of physical, social, or mental rolls. That's an enormous boost if you can swing it. Last thing before we get to domain is the advantage formerly known as mentor, now known as Mala. I'm not a fan of Mala in most circumstances. Sure, I could spend a dot to have another friendly neonate, but isn't going around making allies and enemies of other vampires a thing I'm going to be doing in the game anyway? However, if you want a friend in high places, like a prince, this might be your only shot. On the flip side, my suggestion about enemies can apply here as well. Hey, antagonists are interesting. Why not get points for them? With that said, an elder, or worse, is generally going to be a far more potent threat to a character than a mortal. Sure, you can get 3 points for making the prince your enemy, but you could also be signing yourself up for one miserable unlife. Then domain. Domain is the province of the entire coterie, not one character, but there are still better and worse ways to use it. The first mechanical oddity is that domain by itself is not a mechanical thing. Your domain only has a mechanical effect through chess, hunting difficulty, Leon, your familiarity with the area, and Portion, security. And let me just say, no, I do not know how to pronounce French, so my apologies to anyone who speaks the language. That's the best I can do. Chess is easily the most significant of these. Hunting is important. Hunting is a really frustrating and lame thing as a player to fail at. And hunting difficulties can be quite high. Indeed, the hunting difficulty in your new coterie's domain will be A6, unless you are invested in chess. And at that point, your domain is entirely worthless as hunting grounds because a difficulty of 6 means that hunting is an impossibility. And a couple of dots in chess doesn't change much. Sure, a hunting difficulty of 4 is better than a 6, but it's still really, really rough. At that point, the coterie is probably relying on somewhere else to feed anyway. But if you have a chess 4 or 5, now your hunting difficulty is down to 2 or 1. A storyteller may be unwilling to have a coterie of neonates be granted such rich hunting grounds, but if you can get a chess 5, it is the most valuable use of coterie points I can think of. Unless your storyteller will let you use coterie resources to effectively serve as that level of resources for everyone, and maybe then you can tie back into the money changes everything. Leon and Portion are handy, but substantially less valuable. Leon adds dice rolls to interact with local mortals or get the word on the street. Adding dice can mean powerful pools, but Leon might also almost never come up, unless there are a lot of really handy mortals in your domain. Portion takes dice away from enemies, whether they're trying to sneak around, investigate, plan an attack, etc. Note that this is on top of whatever security systems are in place. The security system sets the difficulty, and then the Portion advantage reduces the dice pool the enemy has to beat that difficulty. But like Leon, it also might not come up much. The utility of both of these will vary greatly depending on how focused a chronicle is on the coterie's domain. But chess is always golden. That's all I have to say today about advantages and disadvantages at the time of character creation in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. Remember, you can go back and check the first 4 videos in this series to get some general tips and to hear my thoughts on attributes, skills, and disciplines. I hope that you have found this video and the others helpful. If you have, please do like or subscribe below. And let me know in the comments if there is any other aspects of the mechanics of V5 that you're interested in hearing about.